Chapter 13. Yet More Chicha Feast. Once again there was a chicha feast. It began like the carousal of the previous weeks. The only thing missing was the evening concert of the bamboo trumpeters. But to make up for this, I suddenly heard vigorous blows with a stick and a fearful howling. A drunken Indian was beating his wife, and his example was infectious. Not long afterwards, a second Indian woman rushed, sobbing, out of the darkness. After her stumbled young Perkirk, with upraised espada, and dealt the fleeing woman a few more blows on her bare back. The days passed in drinking, singing, and dancing, and I had to join fully in the fun. The children left me no peace and drew me into their dance, and my little partner from the previous feast suddenly appeared, arm in arm with Kwarume's little daughter. Both of them crept up close to me, and despite the children's protests, these pert young minxes took me to the dance between them. They were very enterprising, as I well saw, so it seemed advisable to withdraw to my hammock, but that was not the right way to get rid of these young rascals. Young Mome came and joined us. I asked him the girl's name. "She is called Adaid," he said. I asked if she was married. Eod, the one with no wooden plug in his nose, is her husband, he replied, but scarcely had he mentioned Eod's name than the girl began a vehement denial. The young fellow laughed knowingly and assured me that she really was Eod's wife. Eod has 3 wives, he explained. Adaid was beside herself. "Eod is not my husband," she hissed and stamped angrily on the ground. Then she assured me, almost weeping, that Mome was lying and that she had nothing to do with Eod. But it was gradually becoming clear to me why Eod was cross with me. If Adaid was one of his wives, and there could be no doubt about it, then the affection which she had shown me, and which had certainly been noticed, could not possibly be in order. But why did the girl deny that she was Eod's wife, and why did she disown her husband with such aversion? My thoughts revolved round the young girl. I tossed sleeplessly in my hammock. All had grown silent and dark within the hut. Then suddenly, from behind a nearby stack of wood, I heard my name called. The voice was unmistakable. It was Adaid's. I was staggered by such boldness. Was the girl mad? I lay there without moving and pretended to be asleep, the only sensible thing I could do in the circumstances. After the 3 feast days of obligation, when our chicha began to run low, the women of the neighboring hut had just completed their preparations for prolonging the carousal, and the drinking was continued over at Kwarume's. The women in this hut as well insisted on dragging me off to dance. Every visitor presumably had to put up with this. This was all the more surprising since normally men and women did not dance together hand in hand or arm round waist, but always in separate rows. I can only imagine that one of the earlier white or black visitors had given the TUPARI women the idea that we enjoyed mixed dancing particularly. Obviously it gave them some pleasure as well, and the men seemed to see no harm if their naked wives and daughters drew my arm round their necks or their waists and protested vigorously against my misgivings that amid so much warmth of affection I might end up by burning my fingers. But on one of these gala nights I learned that there were in the tribe guardians of morality to whom the great interest shown by the women for the stranger within their gates might gradually appear suspect. Late in the night I was suddenly called away from the dancing by Pameng, a young, unmarried man. "Toto, let us go, time to sleep." I pretended not to hear. What right had this raw youth to give me orders? But Pameng repeated his summons more insistently. There must be something behind it. I left the ladies and followed him into our Maloka. The old magician Tajuru was waiting there, and likewise begged me to please go to bed now. He exchanged a few more words with Iod. Pameng fetched his hammock, slung it beside mine, and brought a few glowing embers in order to keep himself warm for the rest of the night. From now on, Pameng scarcely let me out of his sight for 7 weeks. He slept beside me, accompanied me everywhere, whether I went bathing, to fetch water, or to work, and if during the nights of the festival I had to dance with the Indians, he took up his position somewhere in the darkness, and never lost sight of me for a moment. Was he doing this of his own accord? Did he, as a single man, believe that he had reason to be jealous? Or had he become my guardian on the orders of his fellow tribesmen? Why did not Vito, the chief himself, attend to the matter if he thought I had injured the sacred order of things in his tribe? I could make nothing of it. At last I found an opportunity of sounding the chief Kwarume on the subject of Adade's marriage. Somewhat offhandedly he replied that as a little girl she had been given to Iod as his wife. Her father had been dead for some time. Vito had killed him. He added darkly, that was all. Then I plucked up courage and asked Vito himself about the affair in the course of conversation. Iod was his brother, and his welfare was obviously of great concern to him. He gave me a quick, suspicious glance. "Adade is one of Iod's wives," he then said warily. "Iod has 3 wives. They are all 3 sisters, and none of them is any good." "But Adade was the worst of the 3, he went on. "She treated her husband very badly, would not work, and did not even eat any of the apes and wild fowl which he brought home to her from the hunt." Vito was full of righteous indignation towards his flighty sister-in-law. To me, on the other hand, she seemed rather the victim of barbaric custom, who had the right to force the young girl, scarcely more than a child, to live with Iod, whom she so obviously detested. After all, he had 2 wives already. Was there no more to help this fatherless girl to gain her rights and her freedom? Or had some magic laws or other condemned the girl to this marriage? I determined to solve the riddle. One day I should succeed, without a doubt, in getting to the bottom of even the most intimate customs of the tribe. Hitherto the men had taken the lead at the drinking bouts, even if, where chicha consumption was concerned, the women did not lag far behind. Nonetheless, it had always been the men who offered them this highly prized beverage, with some friendly toast, or even themselves poured some into their mouths. Only in the evening, when some of the niceties of etiquette were relaxed, had the women occasionally helped themselves from the jars of their husbands, brothers, or sons. On the occasion of the next carousal, which began only a few days later, the roles were reversed, and Vito's announcement of a forthcoming women's chicha was fulfilled in the fullest sense of the word. Even early in the morning the mothers of families were running about inside with full calabashes, taking their friends a loving cup. The men were lying in their hammocks or chatting round the big fire, which they had kindled outside. They acted as if they did not notice what was taking place all round them, and patiently waited until the merry women remembered them and offered them a bowl of the women's chicha. Even before dawn, the women who were my neighbors came to my hammock too, and plied me with drink. "Here, my son, drink this chicha," they urged me, and if I did not immediately give a friendly answer, they were impatiently demanding, "Come along now, say, 'Very good mother.'" On the other hand, the younger of the chief's wives, the gentle Api Nuitsa, called me Abitsi, that is, father, and I had to call her Vog, my little daughter. Others addressed me as Toto, grandfather, probably because this Tupari word sounded like the Brazilian word doutor, which was the title their husbands gave me, but perhaps it was also because my beard grew longer and more bristly every day. When young the Indians have no beards, only when they are old men does a sparse stubble grow. The bustle went on all day. In the evening Vito and his men, on the open space outside, plied each other with cooked ground nuts and all sorts of game, once again in a solemn fashion, and when darkness fell, the hut was soon ringing with the rhythmic chant of the Indians. The women, in festive mood, invited me to join their circle. I was feeling far from being in a party spirit. A burny worm had gnawed its way into my arm. For some days I had been feeling a stabbing pain, as if someone were probing about with an awl. It wasn't anything dangerous, said the Indians. They looked at the sore and watched with glee as the disgusting creature from time to time moved its tail in a scarcely visible hole in my swollen forearm. I sought Vito's help. Surely, as head magician, he must be able to do something for me. He made a feeble effort to stupefy the creature with tobacco juice and squeeze it out, but soon gave it up and told me to wait and see what the morrow would bring. "I'm very drunk now. I have no magic power," he admitted, somewhat shamefacedly. But the tipsy women knew no such squeamishness. They seized my arm and scratched away at the swelling with their finger-nails so that I could have screamed. At last one of them pulled out half the worm. They all screeched with delight, and then dragged me off into the hut to dance. My guard sat at the entrance and followed my every movement. He had every reason to be particularly alert. Little Aid had again made herself my dancing partner, and at every opportunity drew me into a dark corner. Without ever tiring, she fetched some of the intoxicating chicha, pressed me to drink, stroked me surreptitiously, and whispered a lot of things in my ear, in her own language. But in the light of the camp fire her eyes sparkled with promise and betrayed what she meant. Suddenly Vito appeared. Greatly excited, he called me over into the other hut. "Come quickly, Amarava is furious. He has hit Brahaba on the head with his espada." I followed the chief across the pitch-dark clearing to the other hut. What on earth could be wrong there this time? Amarava had the reputation of being a particularly wild and hot-tempered fellow. Once, when he was drunk, he had broken the nose and all the front teeth of one of his wives, a dignified matron, with a burning brand. Another wife he had beaten until she was half dead, so that she ran away from him and would have nothing more to do with him. We went into the gloomy hut. I almost collided with Amarava, who, with drawn bow and arrow ready to be loosed, was taking aim at his neighbor, Brahaba. Brahaba, in the fading light of the smoldering fire, was leaning on his long espada, with a sad and solemn face. Beside him stood two friends, armed with bows and arrows. Obviously, they were only waiting for Amarava to loose a shaft in order to put an end to him. All around a crowd of women and children were howling, and Amarava's little wife was trying with a flood of words, and from a safe distance, to make her husband see reason. I took it that Vito had called me to settle the dispute, so I grasped Amarava by the arm and urged him to be sensible. "You're not a wild homno. You are a good TUPARI," I said, and made to take the weapon out of his hand. He thrust me off angrily and growled with fury. Once again I took his arm. "Come, I will go and drink chicha with you," I said in my most coaxing and friendly tones. Amarava looked nonplussed. An Indian can never refuse an invitation to drink chicha. With some hesitation he pushed his bow and arrow up on the shelf, and arm in arm we went to Vito's house. On all sides we were offered chicha by the women, and then Amarava's fit of frenzy passed. We joined in the dance once or twice, had another drink, and Amarava assured me again and again that he was by no means an ill-natured fellow, but a really good and peace-loving man. On the third day of the carousal, the men had already taken possession of the chicha jars. The women were tired of drinking and gave themselves up to their daily occupations, raveling out cotton, spinning, weaving arm or leg bands, boring holes in reddish black and white seeds the size of peas, in order to string them together to make new necklaces, or even trying to cook once more. Most of them, however, lay exhausted in their hammocks, and were sleeping it off in the half-darkness of their hut. This was what the men had been waiting for. Quietly they assembled on the square outside. They had collected every conceivable article to make a noise, gourd rattles, bamboo trumpets, and bone whistles, as well as my aluminum utensils, and then they rushed into the hut with an ear-splitting din and shouting. The women started up screaming from their sleep, and in their first fright seemed to think that enemies had attacked the tribe. When they recognized their husbands, they did not know whether to grumble or to laugh. They abused them a little. Here and there, one of them even grasped a burning log in order to settle the score with the disturbers of their rest. But then they soon calmed down, stretched, and lay down again in their hammocks. The men were delighted at the success of their trick, and laughingly settled down to the chicha jars, which were slowly becoming empty. The little girls arranged their own feast in a low hut which stood beside Vito's, and usually served for the confinements of the women of the tribe. They sang and danced round little pots full of fresh palm wine. Chapter 14. The Baptism. Mani was one of the occupants of the other hut, a lean, long-legged man with a slight squint. He must have been between 30 and 40. He always went quietly about his work, and had so far paid little attention to me, nor had I particularly troubled to make his acquaintance. But about this time Mani became the center of interest. With 2 companions he had been off on a 10 days' hunt, and returned well laden with game. This expedition doubtless had a religious reason, for now, so Vito explained to me, Mani, together with his young wife, had to submit to a series of ceremonies. They had had a child a few months before, and now it was big enough to eat palm grubs. This was an important event, and involved various rites. First, the parents had to fast for 5 days. During this time they were not allowed 1 bite of food, or 1 drop of water. On the morning of the 5th day, Vito came early to my hammock, and told me to get up. "I am going to paint Mani," he said solemnly. "And will the little child eat palm grubs?" I asked. "No," answered the chief magician, almost gruffly, "not until tomorrow." I got up quickly, folded my blankets, and dressed. Then I followed Vito into the neighboring hut, and sat a little distance off in a hammock. Vito sat down in the middle of the passageway. It was not long before the wife of a neighbor named Pakuja appeared and handed the magician a small jar of Genipa juice, together with a brush made of raw cotton. Mani and his young wife approached cautiously. She carried the baby in her arms. They both squatted before Vito on the ground. They were wretchedly thin and weak. One could well believe that they had neither eaten nor drunk for 4 days. Vito pronounced a formula over the die with many gesticulations. He then uttered similar incantations over Mani, who was crouching there reverently and submissively. Finally he dipped the cotton in the dye, and painted a stripe on each of Mani's big toes, his shins, and 2 on each side of his chest. He did the same to the young woman, and finally also to the baby. The little one, not understanding what it was all about, kicked out vigorously, and the magician could not suppress a faint, benevolent smile, just like a person who smiles benignly at the crying of some lusty infant at baptism. A woman now brought the magician and me a gourd of unfermented chicha. We drained them before the eyes of the famished parents. With that, the ceremony was over for the day, and Vito went off with his men forest clearing. For the first time for a long while I was excused working. The remaining half of the Bernie worm in my arm had caused a large swelling. Scarcely were the men out of sight than the women came swarming round my hammock. They wanted to see the photographs and the few illustrated magazines which they knew to be in my baggage. I had to explain each picture to them as well as my defective TUPARI would permit. Then they asked if my parents were still living, how many brothers and sisters I had, and what all their names were. They even inquired pressingly about my grandparents, uncles and aunts, cousins, nephews, and nieces, and finally they wanted to know if I had a wife and children anywhere. Votsi ume, Vayob ume. No, I have no wife and no children. But they did not seem to believe my answer altogether. A man with a beard, and yet without wife or children. "Oh yes, you have. You have a wife and children in Guajara," they insisted. The men had told them about Guajara. Here in the jungle lived the naked Indians, and out there in Guajara lived the tribe of white men, the Tarupa. This was how the Tupari imagined the world to be. They had no conception of its real extent. The women whispered for a while. Then they suddenly brought up their heavy artillery. "You'll marry Kabatoa, won't you?" they asked, and waited eagerly for my answer. Kabatoa was the pretty little daughter of Vito the chief. She could scarcely be 12 years old. "Kabatoa is very small," I said, to give them food for thought, and tried to give the interrogation a humorous appearance. A grown-up woman would be better, but the women were not to be put off. "Well then, what about Nienkyab or Pavab?" Finally, they cried in triumph that they knew I was going to marry Adaid, and with that they all looked at her. In vain she tried to hide behind her neighbor. "Nirum, no," she stammered in embarrassment, and took to her heels. Then the pot-bellied magician, Tajuru, came back from work with his axe over his shoulder. In a trice the women scattered and vanished in the dark interior of the hut. Next morning Vito took me across again to the next hut. His naked body was painted red all over. He sat down near the doorway. A woman laid a small mat at his feet and brought a small pile of leaves, an earthenware bowl with small lumps of uruku dye, a black doughy coloring matter which was partly wrapped in maize leaves, and a big basin full of water. All this she set down before the magician, and he pronounced an incantation over it with solemn gestures. A handful of the leaves he tied together into a bundle, and the remainder he threw into the bowl of water. All seemed ready for the ceremony. The magician called into the semi-darkness of the hut, but he was kept waiting. Only after a considerable time did the parents of the child come creeping along, even thinner and more wretched than on the previous day. Dully and apathetically they stared straight ahead of them. Their cheeks and bellies were sunken. Only the breast of the young woman stood out exuberantly from her lean ribs, and seemed not to have suffered from the fast. Mani sat cautiously down on a stool. The magician pronounced a detailed formula over him, and painted red and black spots on his toes, legs, and breast. He ordered him to bite off a piece from the bundle of leaves, chew it, and spit it back into the bundle. Then the magician took a handful of leaves from the basin and sprinkled the father up and down with cold water. Vito carried out the same ceremony with the mother, and then it was the child's turn. All that it was spared was the biting off of the leaves. At last Vito and the parents stood up. The mother began to wash herself, using a handful of leaves as a sponge. She also washed the baby thoroughly with the water which had been blessed, and finally the young father set about the same task. When he too was clean, the magician strode up to one of the full chicha jars and shared out to such tribesmen as were near some of the fresh maize beer. Only to the parents, who were apathetic, With hunger he took nothing. Without a word they tottered back and crawled into their hammocks. It was still early morning. On the clearing outside the 2 huts the boys were passing the time with a game of head ball, but in a corner little Tarima, the brother-in-law of the child's father, was grinding the magic powder for the snuff-taking session. About 9 o'clock the 4 magicians, and about a dozen of their apprentices and adepts, assembled round the snuff-table. Beside it stood a few earthenware pots. Not far away lay the game which Mani had brought back from his great hunting expedition, a heap of smoked apes, horrible to look at with their twisted and stiffened limbs, and their pitifully distorted faces. Last of all arrived the father, with his carved stool. He was in full regalia. Apart from his everyday adornment, he wore the great feather hoop which fantastically framed his head like a reddish-blue halo. Through the lobes of his ears he had put 2 red aurora feathers skillfully fixed to the thin strips of wood, and his upper arms were encircled with thin white strings of seeds, and from his left shoulder diagonally across his chest he wore a chain of gleaming discs of mother-of-pearl. The first part of the magic session passed off in the usual way. After the second round of snuff, Vito and Quayo muttered unintelligible words, staring into the distance as if hallucinated. Their reddened eyes glowed from out of their faces, dusty with snuff. An Indian placed a large earthen bowl at the door and laid beside it a stone slab, on which was an egg-shaped flint. The magicians began to shovel in some invisible substance from the open air, and Vito murmured without ceasing the same rhythmical charm. Then he beckoned the participants to him, one by one, all in a bowed posture, accepted some of the invisible substance, and carried it carefully in both hands to their little benches. There was, with grandiose gestures, they charmed the mysterious essence into their own bodies. Then something unexpected happened. Before all the participants in the ritual had received some of the mysterious stuff, it seemed to have been exhausted. A murmur of concern went along the row, but Vito began afresh to conjure up, by means of a detailed incantation, some of the essence until he was able to hand to the last person his due share. Not satisfied with this, he repeated the whole ceremony in the same manner. At last the magic fraternity moved themselves and their stools back a little. The main part of the ceremony began. Pakuja, who had been on the expedition with Mani and had bagged the greater part of the game, put the pots in the middle of the passageway. Beside them he piled up the 10 roasted monkeys and laid in front the stone slab with the egg-shaped flint. When everything seemed in order, the chief magician took his seat and pronounced an incantation over the various articles of food. Now Mani's wife was also summoned. She squatted beside her husband on the ground. Vito gave a sign. Mani got up and strode across the pots, but in doing this his foot was not allowed to touch the ground before he had first set it on the flint and the slab. Slowly he approached the magician, who was crouching by the door with a deadly earnest expression, and knelt down before him. The young woman had to do the same. It was with difficulty that she could stand upright, and when she lifted her right foot over the row of jars in order to tread on the egg-shaped stone, she almost collapsed with weakness. Then she knelt beside her husband, and the magician put a bowl of salt water to their lips. They took a little and spat it out again. Next, the magician recited an interminable litany. The kneeling couple did not stir. At last, all three of them went back to the jars. Mani and his wife sat down behind them, the magician in front. Once again he repeated many, many times a monotonous verse, and once again a whole series of incantations followed. But at last he seemed to show the parents some consideration. With his fingers he took a little maize and ground nuts from a pot and stuffed them in Mani's mouth. He also gave him a taste of the other foods and handed him a small bowl of chicha. Then he shook some of the food into the palm of the other's hand. Mani chewed it all reverently and almost with difficulty, as if in his 5 days of fasting he had forgotten how to eat. Meanwhile the baby had been put into the young mother's arms. She too had some food put into her mouth by the magician, but the little one received a fat palm grub, at which he began to suck with great satisfaction. This was the climax of the ceremony. Vito had told me what it was called in a hodgepodge of Portuguese and Indian. Kurumi arakuri kom. The child is eating palm grubs. Thereupon the distribution of the ritual gifts began. Each of the magicians received a roast monkey. Vito handed me an armadillo, which had been lying underneath the heap of apes. And with this the formal proceedings were over. It was already past 3 by my watch. Everyone took his prize home, and then went down to the little stream to wash the snuff from his head. The clearings at which we had been working for weeks had already grown to a considerable size, and once again the men found time to hunt. Apart from spider monkeys, which were the best for roasting, sapajou monkeys, and occasionally an alector, I saw but little game. One day the long-legged Amarava brought home a little cayman, which he had discovered by a stream and killed with his bush knife. Now and then the dogs started an agouti, a paca, or even a land tortoise, but weeks passed before Kurumi, the best hunter of them all, shot a small tejasau, or a deer. It was strange, but the great herds of wild boar which populate the tropical jungles of Central America as far as the Grand Chaco had for many years avoided the hunting grounds of the Tupari. Earlier the chief explained when he and Iod were young, they had bagged many a boar from a herd. Since then this prolific game had no longer been seen in the district. But for all their love of hunting, most of the men had their work in the fields far more at heart, the felling of the trees, for the chief's great clearings was far from the end of the work. Everyone had to prepare his own plantation. If I had at first thought that the tribe lived in a sort of communistic collective economy, I soon learned better as time went on. True, all the men had to work hard, and longed to lay out the plantations of the chief and his brother, but these fields were not intended to feed the whole tribe. They were to enable the leaders to invite the community to drinking bouts of the greatest possible frequency, each one running to 3 full days. For that was the supreme goal of the leader and the real proof of his authority, a large field with inexhaustible supplies of maize, yams, teoba, ground nuts, and above all, yuccas, so that throughout the year he could be a generous host to his followers and neighbors. But in order to achieve this, the chief had to work far more than his subjects. He had to be the first to start work, and the last to leave for home. Only then would his people respect him and be prepared to help. And so the chief's plantations supplied the beer for the carousals, and also frequently a drink on working days. But things were different as far as the ordinary everyday food of the Indians was concerned. True, many men were content, when the chief's plantation was being put into shape, to attack the work with even greater vigor, for then they were allowed to plant a strip for themselves and enjoy the harvest. But anyone with an ounce of proper pride, anyone who wanted to be thought a real man, had to possess his own plantation. In this way he could feed his family better and give a drinking party at least once or twice a year for all the neighbors in his hut. On his holding he planted whatever was most to the taste of himself and his family, and here too he grew his tobacco. For the women there were cotton and uruku plants, and many a humble Indian owned more sugarcane than his chief, particularly if he knew that his wife had a sweet tooth. But just as everyone helped the chief in wood felling, so the chief in turn had to lend them a hand, and since I followed Vito almost daily like his shadow, I gradually got to know all the private plantations. One morning we would be helping one of our friends, the next another. According to the prestige of the owner, the band of helpers was larger or smaller, and the number of these co-workers and the sweat which they exuded in the course of the clearing were the surest indications of his influence in the tribe. But it did also happen that here and there an Indian found that his neighbors left him basely in the lurch and neglected his holding unfairly. Then it might well happen that the malcontent would get up in the middle of the night and give vent to his anger in a solemn speech. But only those who worked hard and without complaint in the fields enjoyed the confidence and help of their friends, and often Vito gave me a hint of this. Look, he would say, for example, Pacuja's off hunting apes again. He fells trees for only 1 day, and then he feels the urge to eat ape flesh, and lets his work go. Pacuduja is no true chief. The week which had begun so well with the baptism of Mani's little son very nearly had a tragic end. I was writing up my diary. The men had gone off without me to wood clearing because my swollen arm would still not allow me to work. In the hut the women were busy at the fire, or spinning, grinding chicha for everyday use, or removing each other's lice, making up their faces and cutting their hair. Now and then a woman chased out the ducks and hens who were trying to pick up some tidbit from the stew pots or the roasting grids, or else she would go running in alarm to a child who was playing about near a fire and was in danger of falling into it. Suddenly, an Indian rushed in through the door. Greatly excited, he shouted a few words into the semi-darkness of the hut. I could not understand what he was saying, but his gestures made me fear the worst. An indescribable stir ensued in the hut. The women, who but a moment ago had been quietly going about their multifarious tasks, ran distractedly backwards and forwards and shouted incoherent remarks to each other. Kamatsuka, the chief's wife, was almost out of her mind. She uttered an angry hissing sound and ran about the hut like a wild hornet. But no one explained to me what was wrong. Could enemies be approaching? I almost wished that for once something unusual might happen in the peaceful Maloka of the Tupari. Then one of the boys who had taught me wood clearing appeared. A tree has fallen on the clearing and has killed Abo, he explained distractedly. Abo was one of the hardest workers in the tribe, a cheerful and inoffensive chorus leader at the feast. Where was that? I asked. On Kwarume's clearing. Pavab was felling a large tree and did not warn the others, and Abo didn't get clear in time. A branch caught him and knocked him down. Is he dead? Te Paroa Ra. He is dead. But in less than an hour the men reported dead came walking into the hut, leaning on his espada. True, his head was covered in blood, and he was as pale as a corpse. Without looking at any one, he lay down in his hammock. I got out my pocket torch and went to examine him. He submitted without a murmur. I cut away his hair, put iodine on the holes in his head, and bandaged him. He also had bad bruises on his body, but the case was much less serious than it had first appeared. In the afternoon, Vito came from his own plantation, which he had begun to prepare for the new yucca sowing. He had the whole story related to him, looked at the white bandage, and muttered a few hurried incantations over it. He did not seem at all annoyed that I had meddled in his province. A few women went on sobbing until the evening and acted as if they were immeasurably shaken by the incident, which had, after all, had a happy ending. Abo's own wife showed far greater composure. She neither wept nor sobbed. With her youngest child at her breast, she crouched beside the groaning man, who did not know how best to lay his battered frame in the hammock, and merely asked him from time to time if there was anything he wanted.